The Galactic University of Travaxis was a marvel of architecture, its glass towers reaching for the stars that twinkled just beyond the atmosphere. Its halls were filled with students from every corner of the galaxy, each aspiring to unlock the secrets of the universe. Luke Ashford had always dreamed of studying here. Now, in his final year, he found himself standing at the threshold of a course that had captured his curiosity from the moment he read its description in Advanced Interstellar History. It wasn't just the allure of ancient alien civilizations that piqued his interest, though that alone would have been enough. No, there was something, or rather someone, who had drawn him in Dr. Soraya Tever. Luke entered the lecture hall early, hoping to catch a glimpse of her before the room filled with the usual chatter and noise of students. The room was vast, designed to seat hundreds, yet the moment he stepped inside, it felt eerily intimate, as though the walls had witnessed countless secrets whispered between lectures. He settled into a seat near the front, scanning the room for any sign of her. He'd heard the rumors, of course. How could he not? Dr. Tever wasn't just known for her intellectual brilliance, she was a curiosity, an enigma, even in a place as diverse as the Galactic University. The Alari species was rare in this quadrant of space, and those few who encountered them often spoke of their radiant beauty and hypnotic eyes. But there was more to it than that. Luke had read papers she'd published, and her insights into alien cultures were unparalleled. She seemed to know more about the lost civilizations of the galaxy than most scholars could ever dream of. A low hum of conversation began to build as more students trickled into the room. Luke tapped his pen against his notebook, his gaze flicking towards the clock above the door. 5 minutes until class. He tried to focus on the names of ancient empires he'd been reviewing, but his thoughts kept drifting to her. What was it about her that commanded such attention? Was it the mystery surrounding her species, or something deeper? Suddenly the room went silent. She had arrived. Dr. Soraya Tever glided into the room with a presence that seemed to alter the very air around her. Her radiant blue skin shimmered faintly, as though reflecting the galaxies she so often spoke about. Her long, flowing robes, a deep violet, that complemented the iridescent hue of her skin, moved like liquid, rippling with each step. But it was her eyes, those piercing silver orbs, that held the room captive. They were hypnotic, shimmering with a depth that seemed to hold entire universes within them. Luke had read that the Alari could read emotions in others, that their eyes could unlock the secrets of a person's heart. He wondered, fleetingly, if that was true. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft yet commanding, filling the hall without the need to raise it. "This is Advanced Interstellar History. If you're here for an easy grade, I suggest you leave now." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but no one moved. Luke watched her, entranced by the way she commanded the space, the way her very presence seemed to reshape the energy around her. "We will be covering civilizations long forgotten," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the students, lingering for a moment on Luke before moving on. "Cultures whose influence still echoes in the stars, though their names have been lost to time. The Averens, the Miradens, the lost cities of Dalveth." Her voice was like silk, pulling everyone in, wrapping them in the stories of worlds long gone. History, as we know it, is not simply a collection of dates and events. It is a map, a constellation of choices, power, and emotion. And if you wish to understand it, you must be willing to look beyond the surface. Luke's heart raced when her gaze locked onto his once more. There was something in the way she looked at him, fleeting, but powerful, like a wave crashing against the shore. Was it his imagination, or did she see something in him that no one else had? As the lecture continued, Luke found himself hanging on her every word. She spoke of alien species that once spanned entire solar systems, their rise and fall painted with tragic brilliance. The Alari's ability to weave emotion into every historical fact was unlike anything he'd experienced before. She didn't just tell stories, she made the past come alive. It was as though she were sharing memories, not lessons. When the class finally ended, the students began to shuffle out, but Luke remained seated, his eyes glued to his notebook. His mind buzzed with questions, and an irresistible urge to talk to her rose within him. She was collecting her materials at the front of the room when he approached, his heart thudding in his chest. Up close, she was even more captivating, her blue skin glowing faintly under the light, her silver eyes flashing as she looked up from her desk. "Dr. Tever," he began, suddenly feeling the weight of his decision to approach her. "I wanted to ask." "Luke Ashford," she interrupted softly, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "Your paper on the political structure of the Triad Dominion was quite insightful. I wasn't expecting such a nuanced understanding from a human student." He blinked, caught off guard that she remembered him by name, let alone something he'd written months ago. I'm flattered, Dr. Teaver," he stammered. "I was just wondering if you had any additional readings on the fall of the Mirrodins. You mentioned their downfall being linked to a cultural shift, but I couldn't find much on that in the library." Her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Luke saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it was there, like a ripple beneath the surface of calm waters. "You're quite observant, Luke," she said, her voice lowering slightly, as if she were sharing a secret. "The fall of the Mirrodins is complex. Most scholars overlook the emotional undercurrents of their downfall, how societal pressure to conform to certain ideals led to their collapse. But that's not something you'll find in the standard texts." Luke nodded, leaning in slightly, drawn to the way her words held layers of meaning. Do you think emotions shape history more than we realize?" he asked, his voice soft but eager. Her eyes gleamed, and she stepped closer, so close that Luke could smell the faint scent of something unfamiliar, an alien spice, perhaps, or a flower from her home planet. "Emotions shape everything," Luke, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But most are too blind to see it." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, and he felt a strange pull toward her, like a magnetic force drawing him into her orbit. He wondered if she felt it too, this invisible connection between them, this inexplicable bond that transcended the normal boundaries of professor and student. The moment passed, and Soraya straightened, her professional demeanor snapping back into place like a shield. "I'll send you some additional resources," she said, her tone now cool and composed. "But remember, Luke, not everything worth knowing can be found in books." Luke nodded, speechless, and watched as she turned and left the room, her robes flowing behind her like the tail of a comet. As he stood there, alone in the empty lecture hall, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His fascination with interstellar history had led him to this class, but now there was something more. Something deeper. Something electric. And it all revolved around Dr. Soraya Teaver. He left the hall, his mind whirling with thoughts of ancient civilizations, lost empires, and the enigmatic professor who had captivated him in more ways than one. As he walked across the campus under the fading light of distant stars, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something far greater than a simple academic pursuit. He could feel it, pulsing in his veins. Something was about to change. And Soraya Teaver was at the center of it all. The days following Luke's first encounter with Dr. Soraya Teaver unfolded in a blur of anticipation. His thoughts drifted back to her constantly during classes, meals, and even as he lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling of his cramped dormitory. There was something about her that he couldn't shake, an enigmatic pull that kept his mind tethered to her, even when he tried to focus on other things. It wasn't just her hypnotic presence, or the electric moment they had shared after class. It was the way she made the ancient civilizations she lectured about come alive, as though she had been there herself, witnessing the rise and fall of alien empires with her own eyes. Her words lingered with him long after the lectures ended, like faint echoes of forgotten worlds. As the semester progressed, Luke found himself staying after class more frequently. At first it was under the guise of asking academic questions, but soon their conversations evolved beyond mere scholarly inquiries. He would linger in the large lecture hall, while the other students trickled out, waiting for the chance to talk with her again. And she, despite the professional distance she worked so hard to maintain, seemed to welcome these interactions, as though she, too, felt something in their connection, something worth exploring. On one particularly quiet afternoon, Luke approached her again, this time with a more deliberate purpose. The lecture that day had been about the Averan Empire, a civilization that had spanned multiple star systems before mysteriously vanishing from the historical record. "Dr. Teaver," he began, standing at her desk after the other students had left, "I was thinking about the Averans and how quickly they disappeared. Do you think their downfall could have been avoided if they had focused less on expansion and more on understanding themselves?" She finished for him, her eyes flickering with that same soft gleam he had seen before. There was a brief pause as she regarded him, and Luke felt as if she were peering into the depths of his thoughts. "You're not wrong, Luke. Many civilizations fall not because of external forces, but because they fail to understand their own weaknesses." He nodded, encouraged by her acknowledgement. It's It seems like no one really talks about the emotional dynamics at play in these societies. It's all political and military strategy. But what about fear? What about ambition, greed? Isn't that what really drives civilizations to ruin? For the first time, a real smile crossed her lips, though it was tinged with a sadness that Luke didn't understand. "You're very perceptive," she said softly, her voice like a melody just out of reach. "Most scholars are content to catalog events and dates, but they overlook the emotional currents that shape history. But those currents, they're everything." Luke felt a flicker of excitement, a sense that he had finally broken through a barrier. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You felt those currents." Soraya's expression shifted, and for a brief moment, Luke thought she might shut down the conversation entirely, but instead, she surprised him. "In my years of research," she said slowly, "I've come to understand that emotion is the most powerful force in the universe. It binds us, breaks us, propels us forward, or holds us back. It is more ancient than any empire, more enduring than any artifact." Luke watched her intently, sensing that she was revealing something deeply personal, something she had kept hidden from the rest of the world. He wanted to ask more, but the moment felt fragile, as if too many questions might shatter the connection they were building. "Do you ever feel it?" he asked instead, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "Do you ever feel like you're part of those histories, like you're connected to them?" Soraya hesitated, her silver eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the air between them feel thick. "I feel many things, Luke," she said finally, her tone guarded but not unkind. "But some things are better left unspoken." Luke didn't push her, though the yearning to understand her, to really know her, gnawed at him. He could see now that there was more to Dr. Soraya Teaver than her lectures and her polished professionalism. Beneath the surface, she was hiding something, a deep well of emotion that she kept tightly locked away. But why? What was she afraid of? Their conversations continued over the weeks, each one peeling back another layer of the mystery surrounding her. Luke learned more about the Ilari people, though always indirectly, through the stories she shared about other cultures. The Ilari were known for their heightened emotional sensitivity, for the depth of their connections with one another. But Soraya never spoke of her own experience as an Ilari. Luke wondered if she missed her home world, or if she had grown too accustomed to the cold, logical confines of human academia to ever feel truly at home again. It was during one such conversation, late in the afternoon after a particularly grueling class, that Luke sensed a shift in their dynamic. The lecture hall was empty save for the two of them. The overhead lights had dimmed slightly as the sun set outside the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Luke had stayed behind, once again asking questions, this time about the Thal Veth, a civilization Soraya had described as emotionally advanced, but ultimately doomed by their refusal to adapt to external threats. "I still don't understand," Luke said, frustration creeping into his voice. They were so connected to each other, so in tune with their emotions. How could they have failed so spectacularly? Soraya, who had been standing at her desk, turned to face him fully. Her silver eyes gleamed in the fading light, and there was a tension in her posture that Luke hadn't noticed before. Their failure wasn't due to their emotional connection, she said, her voice quieter than usual. It was because they let those emotions blind them. They became so consumed by their internal bonds that they forgot the universe around them was changing. Luke frowned, trying to process her words. "So, emotions are dangerous." Soraya's lips pressed into a thin line, and she moved closer to him, her presence filling the space between them with a strange, electric energy. "Emotions are neither good nor bad," Luke, she said, her voice soft but intense. "They are simply powerful. They can destroy, yes, but they can also create. They can connect us in ways that transcend time and space, in ways that defy logic." Luke's breath caught as she spoke, and he realized that they were standing much closer than usual. He could feel the heat of her presence, the soft hum of her energy brushing against his skin like a warm breeze. For a moment he thought about stepping back, about creating some space between them. But he didn't. He couldn't. "Do you ever regret it?" Luke asked, his voice barely audible now. "Suppressing your emotions?" Soraya's eyes flashed with something raw and unguarded. "I've had to," she whispered. "To survive in this world, in this institution, I've had no choice." There it was again. That vulnerability, that crack in her carefully constructed armor. Luke felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to her, to tell her that she didn't have to keep hiding, that she didn't have to be alone in her struggles. But before he could say anything, Soraya stepped back, retreating behind her desk, as if the moment had never happened. "You should go," she said, her voice now cool and detached. "It's getting late." Luke hesitated, unsure of what had just transpired between them, but he nodded, gathering his things and making his way toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he turned back to look at her, standing alone in the darkening room, her blue skin glowing faintly in the shadows. "Thank you, Dr. Teaver," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "For everything." She didn't respond, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, filled with something that Luke couldn't quite decipher. And then, without another word, she turned away. That evening, as Luke walked across the campus, his mind raced with thoughts of their conversation. He had never met anyone like her, so brilliant, so poised, and yet so deeply conflicted. He could feel the weight of her struggles, even if she refused to acknowledge them openly. There was something more between them, something that went beyond student and teacher, beyond mere intellectual admiration. As he passed beneath the towering trees that lined the path to his dorm, Luke's thoughts drifted to the Thal Veth, the civilization that had destroyed itself by becoming too consumed by their emotional bonds. Was that what was happening to him? Was he becoming too emotionally invested in Soraya? And more importantly, was she becoming too invested in him? Luke pushed the thought aside as he reached his dormitory, but as he lay in bed that night, staring once again at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between them, something powerful, something dangerous, something that neither of them was ready to face. And yet, he knew he couldn't walk away from it. Not now. Not ever. The days after that late afternoon conversation with Dr. Soraya Teaver were a whirlwind of tension, anticipation, and confusion for Luke. He had never been one to obsess over anything or anyone, but his mind seemed to have lost its autonomy, gravitating toward thoughts of her with a force that felt beyond his control. He found himself constantly wondering what she was thinking, what she was feeling, and if she too was haunted by the intensity of their growing connection. It wasn't just a crush. It wasn't a passing infatuation. Luke had experienced those before, and this was something entirely different. It was as if he were caught in an invisible web, one woven of secrets, longing, and the unbearable weight of unspoken emotions. Soraya's presence lingered in every part of his mind, a constant hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. In class, Luke noticed that Soraya seemed more distant, her usual grace shadowed by a cool professionalism that felt even more impenetrable than before. She no longer met his eyes during lectures, and the subtle tension between them seemed to grow sharper with each passing day. There were moments when he could almost feel her pulling away, retreating behind the walls she had built around herself. And yet there were other moments, fleeting glances or brief exchanges, where something else flickered between them. Something that neither of them could ignore for much longer. It was during one such moment, late one evening, that everything finally came to a head. The rain outside had started as a soft drizzle but had quickly escalated into a torrential downpour, the kind that made the air feel heavy and the world outside seem distant and blurred. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, with flashes of lightning illuminating the towering spires of the Galactic University. Luke's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of the academic building, his heart pounding in sync with the rhythm of the rain. He had received an unexpected message earlier that day, an invitation from Soraya to discuss a paper he had submitted on the emotional dynamics of the Averan collapse. The message had been brief, almost formal, but the simple fact that she had reached out to him after weeks of maintaining her distance had set Luke's pulse racing. Now, as he approached her office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would be different, that something was about to change. The door to her office was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out into the hallway. Luke hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering just inches from the polished wood. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but the air felt charged, as though the universe itself were holding its breath. He knocked softly. "Come in," her voice called, smooth and steady, but there was a hint of something else beneath it, something that made Luke's stomach tighten. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Soraya was standing by the large window at the far end of the room, her back to him, gazing out at the rain-slicked campus below. The faint glow of her skin contrasted against the dark fabric of her robes, and the soft lighting in the room only seemed to enhance the ethereal quality of her presence. Luke closed the door behind him, the quiet click of the latch sounding far louder than it should have in the stillness of the office. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice sounding too small, too uncertain, for the moment. Soraya didn't turn around immediately. For a long moment she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the storm outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost contemplative. "I did." Luke waited, unsure of what to say. The tension in the room was palpable, like the charged air before a lightning strike. He felt rooted to the spot, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. "I read your paper," Soraya continued, still not turning to face him. "Your insights into the emotional dynamics of the Averans were unexpected. You've grasped something that most scholars spend their entire careers trying to understand." Luke felt a surge of pride at her words, but it was quickly tempered by the undercurrent of something else in her tone, something that made him feel as if there was more to her praise than met the eye. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "But I don't think it's just my insights that are at play here. I've learned a lot from you. From the way you see things, the way you understand the connections between history and emotion." At this, Soraya finally turned to face him. Her silver eyes were shadowed, filled with an intensity that made Luke's breath catch in his throat. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing her next words carefully, as though the balance of the universe itself hung on what she was about to say. "There's something I need to tell you, Luke," she said softly, her gaze never leaving his. "Something I've been struggling with." The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Luke felt his heart hammering against his chest. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "What is it?" Soraya hesitated, her lips parting as though the words were too difficult to say. And then, with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, she spoke the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. "I feel something for you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Luke stared at her, stunned into silence, his mind racing to process what she had just said. He had known on some level, but hearing her admit it, hearing the raw honesty in her voice, made it real in a way that it hadn't been before. "I shouldn't," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've tried to suppress it. I've tried to bury it beneath my work, beneath the rules that govern our positions. But I can't. Not anymore." Luke's heart was pounding in his ears, and he took another step forward, his hand reaching out toward her as if on instinct. "Soraya." "No," she interrupted, shaking her head, her expression pained. "You don't understand. I've spent years building walls around myself, protecting myself from the things I can't afford to feel. In Ilari culture, emotions are powerful, almost sacred. But here, in this institution, in this world." She trailed off, her voice catching on the last word. Luke closed the distance between them in a few strides, standing just inches from her now. He could feel the heat of her body, the faint shimmer of her skin in the dim light, and the tension between them was unbearable. "You don't have to hide anymore," he whispered, his voice hoarse with the weight of his own emotions. "You don't have to be alone in this." Soraya's silver eyes flickered, and for the first time Luke saw something in them that he hadn't seen before: fear. But not fear of him or of the consequences of their connection. It was fear of her own vulnerability, of the emotions she had been suppressing for so long. "I've lived among humans for so many years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen what happens when people let their emotions control them. I've watched them fall apart, watched them destroy themselves. I can't let that happen to me. I can't lose control." "You won't," Luke promised, his hand finally brushing against hers. Her skin was cool, but the touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, as if the very air between them had ignited. "You don't have to lose control. We don't have to lose this." For a moment, Soraya's eyes softened, and Luke could see the struggle within her, the internal battle between what she wanted and what she believed was right. Then, with a sudden, almost desperate movement, she closed the remaining gap between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both fierce and fragile. The moment their lips touched, it was as if the universe itself had shifted. Time slowed, the storm outside forgotten, the walls of the office dissolving into nothing. Luke's hand slid around her waist, pulling her closer, and for the first time he felt the full force of her emotions she had kept hidden from the world for so long. There was a raw intensity in the way she kissed him, as though she had been starving for this connection, this release. Soraya's cool hands tangled in his hair, pulling him deeper into the kiss, and Luke's pulse quickened, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer power of the moment. Her skin, so soft, so smooth, seemed to glow beneath his touch, and the faint hum of energy that always surrounded her had intensified, wrapping around them both like a protective cocoon. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Soraya's silver eyes were filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. She rested her forehead against his, her voice trembling as she whispered, This is dangerous." Luke tightened his grip on her waist, his heart pounding. "I don't care." Soraya pulled back slightly, her gaze searching his. She said softly, "We could lose everything, my career, your future, if anyone finds out about this." "I'm willing to take that risk," Luke replied, his voice steady. "I don't want to walk away from this. From you." Soraya closed her eyes for a long moment, as if trying to find the strength to pull away. But when she opened them again, the resolve in her expression had softened. She pressed her lips to his once more, this time slower, more deliberate, as if savoring the forbidden taste of their connection. "We can't let this go too far," she murmured against his lips. "We have to be careful." Luke nodded, though he knew deep down that there was no turning back now. The line had already been crossed, and their lives, both of them, were now tangled in a web of passion, secrecy, and the unshakable pull of something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The next few weeks became a blur of stolen moments and secret touches, of heated glances across the lecture hall, and whispered conversations in the darkened corners of the university. They were careful, always careful, but the thrill of their forbidden connection only made the intensity between them grow stronger. At night, when the campus was quiet and the stars glittered above, they would meet in Soraya's office or in the hidden alcoves of the university, where no one could find them. Luke quickly became intoxicated by the feel of her cool skin against his, by the way her breath caught in her throat when he kissed her, by the way her emotions, once so carefully controlled, would pour out of her in moments of passion. Soraya, too, seemed to be falling deeper into their secret world. Despite her initial reluctance, she began to trust him more, letting him see the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. She told him stories of the Alari, of their rituals and their beliefs, of the deep emotional bonds they shared with one another, a form of connection far more intimate than anything Luke had ever experienced. In the quiet moments after their encounters, Soraya would show Luke pieces of herself that she had never shown anyone else. She spoke of the isolation she felt in the human world, the way she had to suppress her true nature in order to survive in a place that valued logic and reason above all else. Luke listened, his heart aching for her, and with every secret she shared, his love for her deepened. But even as their bond grew stronger, the weight of their secrecy began to take its toll. They both knew the risks they were taking. Luke could sense the tension building within Soraya, the fear that one misstep could shatter everything they had built. And yet, neither of them could stop. Neither of them wanted to. They were bound together now, inextricably linked by a connection that defied logic, defied reason, and defied the rules of the world they inhabited. It was dangerous, yes, it was reckless, but it was also undeniable. And so they continued dancing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one wrong move could send them both tumbling into oblivion, but unable to walk away from the passion that had ignited between them. Luke couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something far greater than either of them could understand. Something transformative. Something that would change both of their lives forever. The air around the Galactic University seemed to grow heavier as the weeks passed, as though the walls themselves were beginning to press in on Luke and Soraya. The secret world they had built, crafted from whispered conversations, heated touches, and stolen moments, now felt fragile, like a glass barrier straining against the weight of the outside world. The risks they had tried so hard to ignore were no longer distant shadows but looming realities, and Luke could feel the cracks beginning to form. It had started subtly at first. Luke's friends had begun noticing his frequent disappearances and the strange, distant look in his eyes whenever they tried to engage him in conversation. His roommate, Aiden, had been the first to ask outright. "Where have you been sneaking off to?" Aiden had asked one evening, as they sat in their dorm room, the light from the nearby planet casting long, cold shadows across the floor. "You're always gone after class, and half the time, you're not even answering your messages. Got a secret girlfriend or something?" Luke had laughed it off at the time, shrugging and making up some excuse about spending extra hours in the library. But even as he said the words, the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. He could feel the weight of the secrecy closing in, tightening around him like a vice. He had never been good at hiding things. And this forbidden relationship with Soraya was starting to consume him. He had thought he could handle it. He had thought he could keep their secret without letting it affect his life outside of her. But the truth was, he was falling apart. His feelings for Soraya ran deeper than he had ever anticipated, and the emotional toll of keeping their relationship hidden was beginning to wear on him. The tension only grew worse when Luke overheard a conversation between two professors one afternoon while waiting outside the lecture hall. They had been talking in hushed tones, but their words were unmistakable. Dr. Teaver seems different lately, one of the professors, a stern-looking man with graying hair, had said. Distracted. She's usually so composed, but I've noticed something off about her. Have you? The other professor, a woman with sharp eyes, had nodded. I've seen it too. I wonder if something's going on. She's been spending a lot of time with that student, Ashford, hasn't she? Always staying late after class. Luke's heart had lurched in his chest, cold fear spreading through his veins. He'd known the risks from the beginning, but hearing others voice their suspicions made it all too real. For a moment he'd thought about confronting them, denying everything. But he knew it would only draw more attention. So he had stayed silent, his pulse racing as the professors moved on, their conversation trailing off into the distance. That night Luke had gone to Soraya's office, his mind spinning with worry. He had intended to tell her what he'd heard, to warn her, but the moment he saw her sitting behind her desk, the soft glow of her skin, catching the dim light of her office, his resolve had faltered. Instead, they had fallen into each other's arms, the intensity of their emotions manifesting in a flurry of desperate kisses and whispered promises. But even as they clung to each other, Luke could feel the unspoken tension between them. The fear of discovery, of losing everything they had fought so hard to keep hidden, weighed heavy on them both. As the days turned into weeks, Luke found himself more torn than ever. He was deeply in love with Soraya, that much he knew. The passion he felt for her went beyond anything he had ever experienced before. But with that love came the growing realization that their relationship couldn't last not like this, not in secret. And yet, the thought of walking away from her, of losing the connection they had built, was unbearable. One afternoon, after a particularly heated lecture on the collapse of the Thalveth civilization, Luke waited until the other students had left before approaching her. His heart raced in his chest as he walked toward her desk, the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. Soraya, he began, his voice tight with emotion, we need to talk. She looked up from the notes she had been reviewing, her silver eyes narrowing slightly. About what? Luke hesitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He hadn't prepared for this, hadn't rehearsed the words, and now that he was standing in front of her, everything felt tangled. But he forced himself to continue. I overheard some professors talking about you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're starting to suspect something. They've noticed how often we're together, and I think it's only a matter of time before they figure it out. Soraya's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or regret. I see, she said quietly. We're going to get caught, Luke continued, his voice thick with desperation. And when we do, you'll lose everything, your career, your reputation. I can't let that happen to you. Soraya stood up from her desk, walking slowly around to where Luke stood. She was so close now that he could feel the faint hum of energy radiating from her skin, the warmth of her presence filling the space between them. I know the risks, Luke, she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. I've always known them. Then why are we doing this, he asked, his voice breaking. Why are we risking everything? We can't keep going like this. It's not just about your career anymore. It's about us. For a long moment, Soraya didn't respond. She simply stood there, her eyes searching his, as though she were trying to find the right words, the right answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Because I can't let you go. The raw honesty in her words hit Luke like a tidal wave, and he felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had known, deep down, that she felt the same way he did, that their connection wasn't just some fleeting affair, but something far deeper, far more dangerous. But hearing her admit it, hearing her say that she couldn't let him go, made it all too real. I've spent so many years suppressing my emotions, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I've had to survive in this world. But with you, I can't do that anymore. I don't want to. Luke reached out, taking her hand in his. Her skin was cool to the touch, and as their fingers intertwined, he could feel the faint pulse of energy that always seemed to flow between them. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. "But I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Soraya's gaze softened and she stepped closer, her other hand resting gently on his chest. "There's something I need to show you," she said quietly, her voice filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down Luke's spine. Without another word, she led him across the room to a small, hidden alcove he hadn't noticed before. There, in the shadows, was a large, intricately carved stone pedestal, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. "What is this?" Luke asked, his eyes widening as he took in the strange markings. Soraya's silver eyes gleamed as she placed her hand on the stone. "This is an Aelari bonding ritual," she said softly. "It's a way for us to connect on a deeper level emotionally, mentally, spiritually. It's something that goes beyond the physical, beyond words. It's a sacred ritual in my culture, one that very few outsiders have ever experienced." Luke stared at her, his heart racing. "You want us to?" "I want to show you what it means to truly connect," she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I want you to understand me in a way that no one else ever has." Luke felt a mixture of awe and fear swirl in his chest. He had never heard of anything like this before, and the idea of connecting with Soraya on such a profound level both excited and terrified him. But as he looked into her eyes, he realized that he trusted her completely. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. Soraya smiled, a soft, almost sad smile, and guided him to the pedestal. She placed his hands on the cool stone, and as she did, he felt a strange warmth begin to spread through his body, as though the stone itself were coming to life beneath his touch. "Close your eyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a soft command laced with tenderness. Before he could respond, her lips met his in a kiss so delicate, it felt like a breath of stardust against his skin. The world around them faded away as their connection deepened, the kiss filled with both a quiet longing and a fragile, unspoken promise. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of understanding and acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that transcended words. When she finally pulled back, her gaze lingered on his, her silver eyes soft yet filled with the weight of the moment. Luke's breath trembled as he opened his eyes, feeling more connected to her than ever before. And then, in the soft glow of that shared moment, she whispered again, "Close your eyes." Luke did as she instructed, and as soon as his eyes closed, he felt a rush of energy flow through him, powerful, overwhelming, but also comforting, like the embrace of a long-lost friend. It was as if his mind had been opened to something far greater than himself, something vast and ancient. And then he felt it, Soraya's presence, not just beside him, but inside him. Her thoughts, her emotions, her memories, all of it flooded into him in a rush of sensations that made his head spin. He could feel the depth of her love for him, the fear she had tried so hard to hide, the loneliness that had plagued her for years. And he understood, in that moment, just how much she had been holding back. The bond between them deepened, growing stronger with each passing second. It was as though their very souls were intertwining, merging together in a way that transcended the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual. Luke felt her pain, her joy, her fears, all of it pouring into him, and he knew that she was feeling the same from him. When he finally opened his eyes, the world felt different. The connection between him and Soraya was no longer just something intangible, it was real, palpable, a bond that went beyond anything he had ever experienced before. Soraya was standing in front of him, her silver eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling with the weight of what they had just shared. "Do you see now?" she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Do you understand?" Luke nodded, tears welling in his own eyes. "I do," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I understand." They stood there for a long moment, their hands still resting on the stone, the bond between them humming with life. But as the weight of their connection settled over them, Luke knew that their path forward wouldn't be easy. He could feel it, the tension, the fear, the weight of the world pressing down on them. They had crossed a line, stepped into a new realm of connection, and there was no going back. But the risks were still there, looming over them like a dark cloud. And Luke knew, deep down, that the consequences of their love had yet to unfold. As the days went on, the weight of their secret world became almost unbearable. Luke could see it in Soraya's eyes, the fear that someone would find out, that their connection would be exposed, that she would lose everything. And though the bond between them had only grown stronger, the tension that accompanied it was suffocating. One evening, as they lay together in the quiet shadows of her office, Soraya turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep doing this, Luke," she said, her words heavy with sorrow. "It's too dangerous." Luke's heart clenched at her words, but he knew she was right. They had been living on borrowed time, dancing on the edge of discovery for too long. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice filled with anguish. Soraya sighed, her eyes closing for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I can't lose you." "You won't," Luke whispered, pulling her closer. "We'll find a way. We have to." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out, and that the consequences of their love were about to come crashing down around them. The weight of secrecy had become unbearable, like a dense fog suffocating everything between Luke and Soraya. What once had been exhilarating, the thrill of hidden touches and whispered confessions, had now become a burden, threatening to tear them apart. Each passing day brought them closer to discovery, and every stolen moment felt as if it might be their last. For Luke, the agony of living in the shadows was overwhelming. He found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, wondering if someone had noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor, or the way his eyes lingered on Soraya a little too long in class. The fear of losing her, of watching her be destroyed by the very system she had worked so hard to master, gnawed at him relentlessly. But Soraya, she was different. The once unshakable professor, poised and graceful, now wore the weight of their secret like armor. Her eyes, once filled with a quiet intensity, had grown darker, more burdened. She had become distant, her silver gaze often lost in thought, her words fewer and more cautious. One evening, Luke found himself standing outside her office again. The door was slightly ajar, as it always seemed to be when she was expecting him, but this time the air inside felt different. It wasn't just the tension between them, something else lingered in the room, something heavier. He stepped inside and found Soraya standing by the window, her back to him. The soft glow of the campus lights reflected off her radiant blue skin, casting her in an ethereal light. She didn't turn to greet him as she usually did. "Soraya," Luke said softly, his voice full of uncertainty. She didn't respond at first, her hands resting gently on the window frame, her posture rigid. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "It's time we faced the truth, Luke." His heart sank. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. "What do you mean?" Soraya turned slowly to face him, her silver eyes heavy with sorrow. "This what we have, it can't last. Not here. Not like this." Luke felt his chest tighten, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. "But we've come this far," he said, stepping closer to her. "We can figure it out. We'll be more careful." Soraya shook her head, her expression pained. "No, Luke. The walls are closing in. I can feel it." She paused, her eyes searching his, as if trying to find the strength to say what needed to be said. "I've been offered a position at the Institute of Galactic Research. It's prestigious, something I've worked my whole life for." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Luke couldn't speak. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if the very fabric of his world was unraveling. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I haven't accepted it yet," she said softly, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "But I have to consider it. It would allow me to continue my work, my research. But it would mean leaving this place, leaving you." The finality of her words hit Luke like a punch to the gut. He stood there, his mind racing, trying to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. "You're really going to go?" he asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Soraya's gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him, her cool fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. "I don't want to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep living like this. I've spent too many years suppressing who I am, hiding my emotions, pretending to be something I'm not. I don't know if I can keep doing it." Luke reached up, taking her hand in his chest tightening with emotion. "Then don't go," he said, his voice thick with desperation. "Stay, we'll find a way to make it work. I love you, Soraya, I can't lose you." Tears shimmered in her silver eyes, and for a moment it seemed as though she might agree. But then she pulled away, her expression filled with an indescribable sorrow. "I love you too, Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling. "More than you could ever know. But love isn't always enough." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of her words crashing down on them both like an avalanche. Luke felt helpless, standing there as the woman he loved slipped further away from him, caught in the impossible conflict between her desires and her duty. And then, as if summoned by some invisible force, Soraya's eyes flicked toward the hidden alcove in her office, the place where they had performed the Ilari bonding ritual. A flicker of something passed through her gaze, something resolute. "There's one more thing we can try," she said quietly, her voice laced with both hope and fear. Luke frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Soraya took a deep breath, her silver eyes locking onto his. "There's a final step to the bonding ritual we performed. It's rare, almost unheard of between an Ilari and a human," but she hesitated, her voice faltering. "It could allow us to transcend the boundaries of our species, to truly become one mind, body, and soul." Luke stared at her, his heart racing. "What do you mean, become one?" Soraya stepped closer, her hands gently cupping his face as she spoke. "The Ilari have a ritual and ancient practice that goes beyond any form of connection you've ever known. It's a merging, Luke, a joining of our very beings. It would allow us to feel each other in ways you can't even imagine. We would share everything, our thoughts, our emotions, our memories. There would be no more hiding, no more distance. We would be united." The enormity of what she was suggesting took Luke's breath away. The idea of becoming so intimately connected to Soraya, of sharing everything with her, was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had never imagined that such a thing was possible. "Would we still be ourselves?" he asked, his voice trembling. Soraya nodded slowly, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Yes, but we would be more. We would be connected in a way that transcends individuality. It's a choice, Luke, a choice that few ever make, because it requires total trust and total surrender." Luke swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew the risks they both did. The merging could be dangerous, especially between two beings of different species. But the thought of losing Soraya, of letting her slip away without fighting for what they had, was too much to bear. "I trust you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I want this." Soraya's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "Then we'll do it. But once we begin, there's no turning back. We'll be bound together forever." "I know," Luke said, his heart pounding. "I'm ready." The ritual began as it had before, with Luke and Soraya standing before the ancient stone pedestal in the hidden alcove of her office. The symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, their light casting strange shadows across the room. But this time the air felt different, heavier, more charged. Soraya placed her hands on the stone, her gaze locking onto Luke's, as she whispered the ancient Ilari words that would begin the final stage of the ritual. Luke mirrored her, his hands resting beside hers, his heart racing as he felt the first stirrings of energy pulse through him. As the ritual progressed, Luke felt the familiar warmth begin to spread through his body, but this time it was stronger, more intense. It was as if the very fabric of his being was unraveling, being pulled apart and reassembled in ways he couldn't quite understand. His thoughts, his emotions, his memories, they all began to blur, to blend with Soraya's in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. And then, in a rush of sensation, he felt it, the merging. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The boundaries between them dissolved, and Luke could feel Soraya's presence inside him, her thoughts, her emotions, her very essence intertwining with his. It was overwhelming, like being swept up in a tidal wave of sensation, but it was also beautiful. He could feel her love for him, raw and unfiltered, her fears, her hopes, her dreams, and in return he knew she could feel the same from him. They were no longer two separate beings. They were one. Time seemed to stretch, and for what felt like an eternity, they existed in this shared space, this union of souls. There were no words, no need for them. Everything was understood, everything was known. It was a connection that transcended all barriers, physical, emotional, intellectual. When the ritual finally ended, Luke opened his eyes, gasping for breath. He felt different, as though the very structure of his mind had been altered. He could still feel Soraya within him, a presence that would never leave, and he knew that she felt the same. Soraya stood before him, her silver eyes glowing with the remnants of the ritual's energy. "It's done," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We're bound now forever." Luke stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, and for the first time since they had met, there was no tension, no fear, no hesitation. They were one in every way that mattered. But even as they embraced, the reality of their situation loomed over them. The ritual had given them a connection that transcended species and societal norms, but it hadn't erased the world they lived in. They would still face the consequences of their love, the scrutiny, the judgment, the danger. Soraya pulled back slightly, her gaze meeting his. "We'll have to leave," she said quietly. "We can't stay here, not like this." Luke nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "Where will we go?" Soraya smiled softly, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. "There are worlds out there where we can be free, where no one will question our bond. We'll find them together." And with that, they made their decision. They would leave the Galactic University behind, leave behind the secrets and the fear, and venture into the stars to find a place where their love could exist without boundaries. As they stood together, looking out at the vast expanse of space beyond the window, Luke knew that their journey was just beginning. It would be difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but they had each other, and that was enough. Their love had transcended the limits of their species, the constraints of their society, and the weight of their own fears. And now, as they prepared to leave everything behind, they were ready to face whatever the universe had in store for them. Together. Forever.